Hello, beautiful community. Let's look at the Guardian newspaper leaving the platform Twitter X. And this matters far beyond the particular case of this newspaper and the particular case of that social media platform, because we will, for a long time in the coming years, be running into the problem of how narrowly or how broadly we should conceive of reasonable discourse in our culture, especially if we're not individual humans, but journalistic institutions, right? Operating in this culture of post-truth polarization and epistemological pandemonium. So let's read the Guardian statement. You can guess, meanwhile, what I'm going to think of it. Am I going to think it's a good idea they left, or am I going to think it's a bad idea they left? Now, can you guess what the answer is going to be? And you can give me your answer. We want to let readers know that we won't any longer post on any official Guardian editorial account on the social media platform X, formerly known as Twitter. We think that the benefits of being on X are now outweighed by the negatives, and that our resources are best used elsewhere. This is something we've been considering for a while, given the often disturbing content promoted or found on the platform, including far-right conspiracy theories and racism. The US presidential election campaign served only to underline what we have considered for a long time, that X is a toxic media platform and that its owner, Elon Musk, has been able to use its influence to shape political discourse. Social media can be an important tool for news organizations and help us reach new audiences, but at this point, X now plays a diminished role in promoting our work. Now let's throw off all the froth atop a glass that we don't need to discuss, such as the fact that it is indeed, despite their 10 million account there, not a hugely impactful platform for them for several reasons. One being that the algorithm demotes links, and all the Guardian does is post links. Instead, let's look at the substantive issues, and there are two. One is a judgment about the culture, and the second is a judgment about the responsibility of journalistic institutions, or one's own responsibility if one is a journalistic institution. So the judgment about the culture is how wide or how narrow is that bracket of reasonable discourse going to be. Let's talk about this a little bit. Politically and civically, it's one of the worst ideas on earth in a polarized culture facing a crisis of trust to pretend you've won arguments you haven't won. That's to say, to pretend that while there is a cacophony of voices that would indeed need a large bracket to be encompassed, that because that cacophony is simply expressing primitive instincts or irrationality or false consciousness or misinformation or disinformation or victimhood of malign foreign influence, that you can just abstract them away. You can't abstract them away because you don't get to choose who you share the table of politics with. The table of politics isn't something you get to leave except by seceding or emigrating. If you emigrate, you can just face another table of politics, and you will too if you secede. So you don't get to choose who you do politics with. And the value of toleration, that is an extraordinarily depleted value in our culture. It's a negative value. Toleration isn't about, oh yes, we're all in this together. Toleration is about, I don't like you, but let's share space anyway. Right? That's an extraordinarily depleted value in this culture that on the one hand has got an ever-broadening cacophony of polarized voices, but on the other hand has a certain pocket of online liberals, among others, who feel that it's okay to still continue conceiving of public discourse within a very narrow bracket because everybody who's outside is irrational. Well, when you think like that, then you lose to Trump. When you think like that, you yourself become politically ineffectual because you're not dealing with the real world. You become depoliticized, and in virtue of what seems to you like a more compelling and powerful commitment to your values, you actually undermine the sustenance of your values in your political culture. So if there's a practical principle that emerges out of this, it's the idea that you do not cede platforms even if the platforms are quite corrupt, even if the platforms are quite unhealthy. Unless you find that you yourself are effectively doing damage with your presence on the platforms, which The Guardian is obviously not doing. So, on the basis of this speculation, that's all it is, because it'd take a long time to seriously ground what I've said. It's just a speculation, a couple of throws of paint on the bigger canvas we would need to build over time. But if we just take that that's all we're going to do in this chat, we can conclude that The Guardian's explanation is risible. They're leaving because of far-right conspiracy theories and racism, and because Elon Musk has irresponsibly influenced political events. And I might add something that they didn't put in their piece, that Elon Musk's platform X now is a certain kind of an arm of the US government, because Musk is working with Trump and Musk is overseeing the Twitter algorithm. So it's an extension of this administration that is run by this post-truth, anti-institutional populist Trump. Okay. But it's still one of the major public squares, as imperfect as it is, right? And when you retreat from it, you don't retreat to another square that has everything that Twitter X has minus the faults. You're actually disconnecting from a good number of people who are interacting in this square, who you will simply stop interacting with if you leave. Now, there is a very powerful objection to what I've said, and that is that it's okay for you to leave if you don't think of yourself as addressing the culture or the country, whatever country that might be, the UK in this case, at large. And so here we move from the question of this judgment about whether you think of discourse as something to be conceived in a narrow or a broad way in our culture, to the question of what the responsibilities to their own readers and listeners of a journalistic institution are. And it's absolutely apparent, even though The Guardian don't always behave like this, to put it mildly, that aspirationally they are not just working for a particular demographic. They're still trying to be a kind of national newspaper that speaks to lots of very different kinds of people in the world, and that speaks to Britain as a whole. If that's how you conceive of yourself, you have got to understand that you have an acute responsibility to speak to people who are suspicious of you and who don't like you. You have an acute responsibility to interact with these people, both in order to form a constructive relationship with them, and in order to just keep making whatever you're up to available to them, whether they like to pick it up or not. So what I'm looking here is an elementary failure to grasp that we're not in 1995, but we're in 2024 at the level of how broadly or narrowly we should conceive of public discourse. Right? You don't want to go around pretending you've won arguments you haven't won. There's nothing wrong with being committed to a strong progressive minority position, but you can't go around pretending that somehow the culture that rejects your position is in fact only rejecting it because of irrationality or ignorance or victimhood of malign foreign interference, on and on and on and on. So that's the mistake number one. There's a mistake at the level of responsibility. The Guardian has the responsibility to speak to people, including people who are partly entangled in the peddling of what The Guardian calls far-right conspiracy theories and also racism. And what kind of a remark is it, racism? Well, who is racist? Apolitically, most humans are a tiny bit racist. They carry lots of different kinds of prejudice. In political terms, racism has to be something more robust, right? It has to be something that you can identify in a more clear-cut way than the conception of racism that you might use in a philosophy seminar. But even according to that clear-cut differentiation, we're clearly going to have lots of problems with racism in our society. And so what, you're not going to speak to people who peddle racist viewpoints? You're not going to engage with them? I mean, have you completely lost your mind? So an extraordinary retreat from understanding the nature of civic discourse in our culture, and an extraordinary failure of journalistic responsibility to speak to a country as a whole and to make yourself available to people who resent you. Now, I'm actually less emotional about this than I've just made out, simply because this is the most predictable step for The Guardian to take. But nevertheless, it is counterproductive, because you do not seed major platforms unless you are forced to seed them. And there are issues of responsibility there that really matter, even if The Guardian did manage to make a successful argument about how in the end they're not getting much traction there on the platform because of the nature of the algorithm, because of the nature of the their content, which is entirely links based and so on. So we will have this conversation over and over and over and over and over, and I'm over and over and over and over and over going to say a broader conception of public discourse is what we need. And we need serious journalistic institutions to not pretend they've won arguments they haven't won, and to keep on speaking to the country as a whole, whatever country they're in. This does not apply to individual humans, right? Nothing that I've said so far suggests anything about whether you as a private individual should leave Twitter X or not. In the case of a private individual, the main consideration should actually be mental health. That's a conversation for another time. Lots of love.